Good evening to all. On behalf of Bcf-India, I am privileged in introducing our today's speaker, Mr. Thomas Starnes, Key Biodiversity Area Program Officer at IUCN, Cambridge, England, UK. He has completed his Bachelor's in Environmental Science, Biodiversity and Conservation at University of Plymouth. He is currently serving as a Biodiversity Area Program Officer with IUCN with Freshwater Biodiversity Unit in Cambridge, UK since February 2020. He works closely with IUCN Red List Unit and the Key Biodiversity Area Secretariat. This role involves the identification and nomination of key biodiversity areas for freshwater species. He is also acting as a chair for the Cambridge Conservation GIS Group and Wildlab Net GIS Group. He is a charter member of the Open Geospatial Foundation. Also, he is a member for World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. He is a contributor on Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, HOTS, Missing Map Project, and coordinate Mapathon for OSM Earth. He has a wide range of experience in conducting international field research, especially in the region of Southeast Asia, Madagascar, and the Middle East. He served various positions in the field of conservation, and during 2018 to 20, he worked as a senior GIS analyst in RSVP, and he was playing an important role for managing the conservation data and for the help desk, and which promotes GIS mapping and the data management service to RSVP and the partnering organization. During 2016 to 18, he was a GIS analyst, and also he was working as a data officer in amphibians and reptile conservation in England. During 2012 and 13, he worked as a spatial analyst in Royal Botanic Garden Group. During 2010 and 12, he was working for the aquarium host in National Marine Aquarium. He is also an expert of ArcGIS Desktop, latest version 10, and spatial analyst, and red monitoring and measurement, and reporting and verification trainers, and basic of geographic coordinate system, creating, editing, and management geodatabase for ArcGIS Desktop. During this COVID-19, BCF extends their platform in connecting the eminent professionals, stakeholders, students, public on this international webinar. We are delighted to connect our eminent speaker, Mr. Thomas Starnes, Key Biodiversity Area Program Officer at IUCN, Cambridge, England, UK, on this virtual forum, and waiting to listen on identification of freshwater key biodiversity area, focus on Western Ghats. Over to you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you to Bcf-India for the opportunity to present to you all. It's really great to see so many people here on the presentation, particularly people who are based in the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot. I'm hoping at the end of this presentation, I'm actually going to ask if anyone has any data or information that they can send me to help with my work, actually. So for those of you who are here just to enjoy and to learn something about KBAs, then welcome. And yeah, as I say, for some of you, I'll be asking whether you can actually help as well. That was a very thorough introduction. Thanks. So I won't introduce myself anymore. You all know everything about me now. Okay, so today I'd like to talk to you about, excuse me, about key biodiversity areas. So this is an initiative which I'll give you some background on. Specifically, I'm coming from the angle of freshwater key biodiversity areas. So key biodiversity areas designated for freshwater taxonomic groups. And also at the end of the presentation, I'll focus specifically on a couple of examples from the Western Ghats in India. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to assume quite a low level of background knowledge on key biodiversity areas, and I'm going to use some of the latest training materials in key biodiversity areas from the KBA Secretariat and go through those with you. So I'll give quite a kind of high-level introduction to what key biodiversity areas are and what their purpose is and how they can be implemented, and particularly in the context of international and national policy. And after I've gone through that, then we'll look at, as I say, some examples from the Western Ghats specifically. And finally, as I mentioned, I'll be putting out a call for any help, any data on freshwater species in potential new key biodiversity areas, which we're trying to identify in the Western Ghats specifically. So hopefully that's what you're all here for, and hopefully that sounds like something you'll all be interested in. So without further ado, an introduction to key biodiversity areas. The key biodiversity areas, let me just, there we go, just adjust my screen. So specifically, we'll look at the concept of biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis, and more specifically, what the role of KBAs is in global biodiversity conservation. The KBA and thresholds for their identification. You can access that online also through the KBA website, and in a further slide there'll be a link to the KBA website, so you can go and find that, download it, and read it at your leisure. So biodiversity is defined in this context as diversity within species, and that includes genetic diversity as well. So the three elements of biodiversity being species diversity, but also ecosystem diversity as well. So that's an important context. Somebody's just brought me a coffee. So if you were looking at the webcam, that's what that was. That's the benefits of working from home. So it's important to note that key biodiversity areas can be identified not just for species, but also for ecosystems as well. Although in this presentation, I'll focus mostly on the species key biodiversity area triggers. So, as I'm sure you all know, biodiversity loss is occurring at an alarming rate across the world's terrestrial, freshwater, and marine biomes. And we've seen this through things like the Global Environment Outlook reports published recently, and Living Planet Index, all of these big reports pointing in the same direction. So many species and ecosystems are at risk of being lost forever, potentially. And this is a crisis in its own right, but it also has significant negative consequences for human well-being through the loss of ecosystem services. And you'll see IUCN talking a lot at the moment about nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, the same kind of concept. Such as pollination, fisheries, and freshwater and cultural heritage. If you've heard of the IUCN, most people who have heard of the IUCN hear about us first through the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. So the Red List identifies species that are most at risk of extinction based on parameters such as population trends and geographic concentration and population sizes. So most people who have heard of IUCN tend to have heard first of the IUCN Red List. I recommend, if you're not familiar with the IUCN Red List website, you do go and have a look at that. There's a whole wealth of information on there on all species which have had their extinction risk assessed. And so there are multiple categories of extinction risk, ranging from, well, most species actually haven't been evaluated to date, and this varies between taxonomic groups. So there have been comprehensive assessments for taxonomic groups such as mammals, for example, amphibians and birds. Some species are data deficient, which means that there's simply not enough information available at the moment to make an informed categorization as to the extinction risk of the species. Then least concern and near threatened, that's not to say that we shouldn't worry about those species, but they don't tend to be conservation priorities, at least not in a global context. Although they may be threatened nationally or regionally still. But the three threatened categories are vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And these are the species which often will trigger a key biodiversity area. So key biodiversity areas are often designated for globally threatened species or ecosystems. So I mentioned ecosystems, the importance of ecosystems as well. In the past half a century, ecosystems have declined at a faster rate than any other period in history. Unlike species, ecosystems don't disappear, but they're transformed and replaced by different ecosystems with different species, different interactions and ecological processes. So when this happens, we can consider that an ecosystem can collapse, such as when native characteristic species are lost from the ecosystem, or when species are lost that perform key ecological roles, which reduce in abundance and are no longer able to maintain those kind of core ecosystem functions. And again, talking about the nature-based solutions and ecosystem services. So there's also an IUCN Red List of ecosystems. It's not as high profile as the Red List of threatened species because it's much newer. It was only released much more recently, relatively. But again, there's a website that you can go and explore this as well. And that actually categorizes different ecosystems in terms of their threat, again, from least concern. It uses the same categories as the Red List of species. And so the risk to ecosystems is based on geographic distribution, changes in distribution, and environmental degradation and disruption of biotic processes or interactions. There's an urgent need to address this biodiversity crisis, and safeguarding habitats is one of the most effective conservation strategies available to us. But this crucially depends on knowing which areas in the world contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity so that we can safeguard those sites. Particularly think of things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, Aichi Target 11 on protected areas. There's a specific mention within the definition of this target of areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And so there are many different ways of identifying areas of importance for biodiversity at varying spatial scales. So, for example, I've mentioned already the Western Ghats. That's a biodiversity hotspot as defined by Conservation International. So hotspots and eco-regions are regional priorities, but most conservation action occurs at a site scale. BirdLife International's success at identifying conservation sites of importance for conservation through the important bird and biodiversity areas approach has led to similar approaches for other taxonomic groups, with various adaptations to the methods. But the problem was that this can be confusing for decision makers, having important bird and biodiversity areas and important butterfly areas, important areas for reptiles, important plant areas. They all have different methods for identifying these sites, and that was felt to be confusing. Okay, so at the World Conservation Congress in Bangkok in 2004, IUCN members recognized a need for a unifying framework for identifying important sites for all biodiversity. And so there was a resolution that was passed that specifically says that there needed to be a worldwide consultation to agree a methodology to enable countries to identify key biodiversity areas, drawing on data from the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species and other data sets. So that would now include the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, which didn't exist at that time, and building on all existing approaches. And so there was a big, long consultation progress involving all different kinds of stakeholders, including IUCN members, other conservation organizations, academics, governments, donors, and the private sector. That's all kind of led up to this publication of the KBA standard in 2016. So the conservation community kind of rallied around this common approach to identifying sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. So these key biodiversity areas provide an umbrella framework, and they're designed to harmonize existing approaches to the identification of important sites. The global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas was formally adopted by IUCN Council and launched alongside the KBA partnership at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016. And 13 of the world's leading nature conservation organizations have now committed to identify, map, monitor, and conserve KBAs around the world. And you can see those 13 organizations. So that includes, of course, IUCN. So KBAs are identified as sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And they're identified using criteria which are designed to capture elements of biodiversity across genetic, species, and ecosystem levels. The criteria are applicable to marine, freshwater, terrestrial, and subterranean systems. So hopefully that just about covers everything. KBAs are sites with delineated boundaries, and the KBA standard defines a site as an area which essentially has to be ecologically relevant, but also it has to be a manageable unit. So it could be an existing protected area or another managed conservation unit. So the idea is that you have to be able to have a management plan which could cover that site. So most globally threatened species depend on specific sites, at least in some parts of their life cycle. And this includes many area demanding species that generally occur at low densities or move over long distances. Most of these species require a combination of conservation action at the site and the landscape or seascape level. And only a few species occur at such low densities, or they're so highly nomadic, that they don't regularly occur at sites in significant numbers. So KBAs are identified based on the current distribution of biodiversity and not the expected future distribution. So sites that currently meet the criteria and thresholds should be recognized as KBAs, even if biodiversity elements may be lost from the sites due to climate change and other threats. That's important. Conversely, sites that don't currently meet the criteria and thresholds can't be identified as KBAs based on predictions that they will do so in the future as a consequence of climate change. So in many cases, KBAs are already well conserved. Where additional management is required to secure the persistence of biodiversity at the site, there are many management options available. So we've mentioned already protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So often when KBAs are identified, it's actually identified that an existing protected area, such as a national park, would qualify as a key biodiversity area, and the boundary of the national park will simply be adopted as the boundary of the key biodiversity area. In other cases, key biodiversity areas are identified in locations which have no formal protected area status. And in other cases, there are kind of cases of overlapping boundaries where it's kind of somewhere in between where it might be partially protected. I'll show you the Key Biodiversity Areas website dashboard later on that actually gives a breakdown of the proportion of KBAs in India which are protected or partially protected as well. So given that KBAs are sites of global importance for biodiversity, they should be taken into account in conservation priority setting. Where KBAs are threatened, decisions about management action should be based upon a prioritization process that combine data on the site's importance for biodiversity with information on threats and other relevant factors such as ecosystem services and cultural values. In some cases, a KBA may not become a national priority for a conservation action, for example, because it's not threatened, but it would still remain a KBA. So KBAs provide an effective bridge between assessment process and conservation planning, and an important step towards conservation action. Information on the location of KBAs and the biodiversity they contain is made publicly available through the World Database on Key Biodiversity Areas. And as I say, I will show you, I'll give you a link to the website where you can go and view the interactive map yourself. And I'll also illustrate with a couple of slides a bit later on in the presentation. So this information can then be used by governments, funding agencies, and the private sector. Governments can use this information to support conservation priority setting, the strategic expansion of protected area networks, and the implementation of international environmental agreements, including, as we've mentioned already, the Convention on Biological Diversity, Aichi Target 11, and on protected areas, and also commitments to prevent species extinction, such as through Aichi Target 12. So conserving KBAs is essential to help countries also to meet their commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, protected area coverage of KBAs is an official indicator for 3 of the SDG targets. Also, conservation funding agencies, such as the Global Environmental Facility and the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, use this information to guide investment in conservation. So both GEF and CPF are founding members of the KBA partnership, and the CPF are funding a current project where we're identifying key biodiversity areas in West Africa. They've funded identification of freshwater key biodiversity areas in the Mediterranean, and they funded our previous work in the Western Ghats as well. New protected areas established with GEF support must be globally significant, as defined by the KBA standard. So it's important for funding as well. In terms of the private sector, information on KBAs is also channeled to international financing agencies, such as the International Finance Corporation, the IFC. So these agencies use this information in safeguarding policies and investment decisions. So that provides strong incentives to companies seeking international financing to avoid environmentally destructive impacts in these areas. KBAs are now recognized by the IFC and the Equator Principles as likely critical habitat. Information on KBAs is also channeled to large natural resources-based corporations through the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, IBAT. And again, you can go and, if you type in IBAT into Google, it should be the first hit, I think. So that's the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. And that's one of the key tools that this information feeds through into, because that's used by developers and the private sector to screen potential impacts of developments within their sites. So they can take this information into account early in the project exploration and development phase and avoid, hopefully, negative impacts on KBAs where possible. There's actually specifically a freshwater report as well that's available through IBAT, so that consultants can actually see whether there are key biodiversity areas upstream or downstream of a proposed development, and they can also see whether their development is likely to impact on migratory fish on swimways, for example. So guidelines on business and KBAs have been developed to help businesses engage in KBA conservation and minimize their impact on these globally important sites. And you can download or access those guidelines also through the Key Biodiversity Areas website. Just a couple of examples here. So Lake Natron is the most important site in the world for lesser flamingos. So this is in Tanzania. It holds about 20% of the global population of flamingos, of lesser flamingos. It's featured in many natural history documentaries. If you've seen flamingos in a natural history documentary, such as any of the David Attenborough BBC documentaries, you've probably seen this lake. So it's designated as a Ramsar wetland of international importance for its waterbird populations. Tata Chemicals, which is, as you probably know, an Indian company, together with the Tanzanian government, set up Lake Natron Resources Limited to construct and operate a soda ash factory on the site. So this was meant to be a $450 million development. It would have had a major effect on the lake and its waterbirds through the construction of the factory, increased traffic, such as heavy machinery and mining operations. It would have also negatively affected local communities and the economic opportunities arising from tourism, for example. So to counter this threat, the Lake Natron Consultative Group was set up, which included 56 organizations in 2011, including national and international stakeholders. And the platform was led by BirdLife International, who are a key partner in the KBA partnership. The group carried out a wide range of activities, including raising awareness and campaigning, and conducting cost-benefit analysis about the development that was proposed for the lake. And in the end, Tata Chemicals agreed to withdraw the project proposal. The Tanzanian government tried to get the proposal through again and revived it a few years later, but ultimately this hasn't succeeded. Finally, in 2018, the government decided to abandon the project for good. And I think that the Key Biodiversity Areas designation played a part in that as well. So it's recognizing and highlighting that the site is important for global biodiversity, and lots of people are looking at KBAs, and so it adds a lot of weight, I think, to a site if it has KBA status in terms of its kind of conservation priority. Okay, so I'll continue. This is the second half of the introduction to key biodiversity areas. So I'll go through this before we then look at the specific case of the Western Ghats. So we've mentioned the global standard. So we'll go into a bit more detail now about what's actually in the global standard in terms of what are the categories and criteria that can be used to identify these key biodiversity areas. So the KBA standard provides a globally standardized science-based approach for identifying KBAs, and the general approach is similar to that used in the IUCN Red List, which is highly successful and widely accepted. So it's based on a set of definitions, criteria, and quantitative thresholds, which are designed to ensure that KBAs are identified in an objective, repeatable, and transparent way. It's important that the KBA standard remains stable for a period of time to enable comparisons of sites identified as KBAs across regions and over time. So most previous approaches to identifying important sites have been species-based. The KBA standard goes beyond that to include species and ecosystem-based criteria. Genetic diversity is also addressed under some of the species-based criteria. And collectively, the criteria aim to capture the various ways in which a site can be important for the global persistence of biodiversity, because it holds threatened or geographically restricted biodiversity, has outstanding ecological integrity, maintains biological processes, or is shown to be highly irreplaceable through quantitative analysis. So there are 11 criteria grouped into these 5 high-level criteria, A, B, C, D, and E. And we'll go into just a little bit of detail in each of these. The most developed criteria are criteria A and B on threatened biodiversity and geographically restricted biodiversity. The other criteria are in the standard, but the details of those criteria are still being thought out about exactly how they're going to work. So first, let's look at criterion A, threatened biodiversity. So sites triggering criterion A are important for global biodiversity, threatened biodiversity. So again, when we looked at the IUCN Red List assessments, those are species which are categorized in any of the 3 threatened categories. So that's vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered species. So they have to hold a significant proportion of the global population of a species at risk of extinction. So that's subcriterion A1, or a significant proportion of an ecosystem type at risk of collapse. Threatened ecosystem types, that's subcriterion A2. If these sites were to disappear, the risk of species extinction or ecosystem collapse would be greatly increased. Criterion B on geographically restricted biodiversity. These sites hold a significant proportion of the global population of an individual geographically restricted species, co-occurring range-restricted species, geographically restricted species assemblage, or geographically restricted ecosystem type. By definition, these are relatively few sites where geographically restricted biodiversity exists, so there are few spatial options for safeguarding the biodiversity found at each of these sites. It's important to highlight that this criterion doesn't depend on the species being threatened. So in fact, if a site holds 10% of the global population of a least concerned species, then that still qualifies as a key biodiversity area, because it still contains a high proportion of the species global population. So it's still very important for that species. Criterion C is about ecological integrity at a global scale, and these sites maintain their full complement of species in their natural abundances or in terms of biomass. They're large enough to support the natural movement patterns of species and allow for the unimpeded functioning of broad-scale ecological processes. They're essentially undisturbed by significant industrial human influence. So these sites would tend to be larger sites, usually. Sites with outstanding ecological integrity are globally rare and provide the few remaining options for conserving intact ecological communities at a sea or landscape level. Sites triggering criterion D maintain important biological processes that are geographically restricted. So this is about biological processes. D1 sites hold a significant proportion of the global population of a species while aggregated for life history processes such as feeding, breeding, or migration. D2 sites sustain a significant proportion of a species' global population during periods of environmental stress, such as in a severe drought or warm water events in the ocean. D3 sites produce a very high proportion of the propagules, larvae, or juveniles required to maintain the global adult population of a species that later disperses elsewhere. So these are recruitment sources. There are relatively few sites where such geographically restricted biological processes occur, so there are few spatial options for safeguarding these biological processes. Finally, sites triggering criterion E have a very high irreplaceability for the global persistence of biodiversity as identified through complementarity-based quantitative analysis of irreplaceability using techniques derived from systematic conservation planning. So sites identified in this way will tend to be identified through a spatial mapping and modeling approach. The criterion identifies sites that are irreplaceable because of their combination of biodiversity features and may identify exceptional areas that don't meet any of the other criteria. There's still quite a lot of work to be done on defining, on actually using this criterion, and sites have been identified using a number of different methods, but some people have made an attempt at identifying KBAs in this way, and there are some examples in the literature which you can find. So that's an overview of the 5 high-level KBA criteria. All sites should be assessed against as many KBA criteria and for as many taxonomic groups and ecosystem types as possible, even though a site needs to meet the thresholds for only one criterion to qualify as a KBA. So it only takes one species assessed against one criterion to pass the thresholds to identify a KBA. But the more evidence that we can provide that a site meets the relevant criteria and the relevant thresholds, the stronger it is and the longer it should persist as a key biodiversity area. So it's always good to, when proposing a key biodiversity area, to include as much information about it and assess against as many of the criteria as possible. Within each criterion, you have sub-criteria as well. So as for the IUCN Red List, many of the criteria include sub-criteria that describe explicitly how the site contributes to the global persistence of biodiversity. So for example, within criterion A on threatened biodiversity, A1A sites are important for critically endangered or endangered species, whereas A1B sites are important for vulnerable species. The KBA criteria have quantitative thresholds designed to ensure that KBAs are identified in a way that is objective, repeatable, and transparent. The thresholds were developed through a series of technical workshops and testing with datasets covering various taxonomic groups, systems, and regions. So, for example, when we say that a site holds a significant proportion of a globally threatened species, then under A1A, the threshold is 0.5% of the global population for a critically endangered or an endangered species, whereas under A1B, it's defined as 1% or more of the global population of a vulnerable species. A1E represents a special case where the entire population of a critically endangered or endangered species is located within a single site. And so this is identical to the Alliance for Zero Extinction, or AZE designation. So essentially, it means that that site is the only site for that species globally. And if you lose that site, then you've lost the species, and it would therefore be extinct. So those sites are really important. For globally threatened species, the thresholds are quite low, but still considered globally significant. So this effectively builds a precautionary approach into the thresholds themselves. And that's why when you have a species which is more threatened, the threshold for the proportion of the global population is lower. And that's that precautionary approach which is built in. And the thresholds are generally higher for other criteria, such as B1, which requires 10% of the species' global population for non-threatened species. There are various assessment parameters, as for the IUCN Red List of threatened species, and it's designed to be flexible to enable the identification of KBAs for biodiversity elements with limited data. So for species, the thresholds are defined in terms of the percentage of the global population size at the site. If the estimates for the number of mature individuals are not available, and they're often not available, particularly for freshwater species, there are several proxy parameters that can be used instead, which include the area of occurrence, the extent of suitable habitat, the range of the species, or the number of localities. Distinct genetic diversity can also be used as an assessment parameter. This differs from other assessment parameters in that a site holding the threshold proportion of distinct genetic diversity can qualify even if the proportion of the population size at the site falls below the threshold. So even if the site doesn't include a high proportion of the global population of the species, if it can be demonstrated that it contains a distinct genetic diversity within that species, then that can also be used to identify it as a key biodiversity area. Assessment parameters will be covered, well, they are covered in more detail if you go through and follow some of the links, which I will share at the end of the presentation through the Key Biodiversity Areas website. You can go and read in much more detail about these criteria and assessment parameters. There are some key terms used in the KBA standard which have very specific definitions to ensure that the KBA criteria are applied consistently across species, ecosystem types, and systems. So population size, for example, is measured in terms of mature individuals, where the definition of mature individuals can be adapted for various life forms, such as colonial organisms. It's important to refer to the definitions set out and they're in the KBA. The results. It's also really important, of course, to confirm the presence of the species within the site. So if you were using mature individuals as an assessment parameter to identify a KBA, you would automatically have confirmed the presence of the species within the site. However, when you're using other proxy parameters such as the area of occupancy, the extent of suitable habitat, or the range of the species, you need to do an additional step to actually just check and confirm that the species is actually present within the site. And ideally, the data to confirm the presence of the species within the site would be at least within the last 8 to 12 years at the time of the KBA identification. As well as confirming that the species is present in the site, many of the species-based criteria also have a second threshold, which is the number of reproductive units present at the site. So the reason for that is it's intended to ensure that the species occurs at the site in sufficient numbers for the population to maintain itself beyond the current generation. So at sites where the species occurs in only very, very small numbers that aren't sufficient for reproduction, they shouldn't be identified as KBAs. So that's why you have reproductive unit thresholds as well. And in one of the previous slides where we looked at threatened species, subcriteria A1A and A1B, you might have noticed that there were reproductive unit thresholds of 5 and 10 reproductive units respectively for those subcriteria. So in terms of actually delineating KBAs, this is the process of defining the geographic boundaries of the KBA. The aim is to derive site boundaries that are both ecologically relevant and also provide a basis for potential management activities within the site. So delineation is an essential step as a part of identifying a key and proposing a key biodiversity area. And it's important that it needs to occur in consultation with rights holders and other relevant stakeholders as well. So ideally, this would include stakeholders from civil society, from the private sector, from government agencies, and traditional land rights holders, and species and conservation experts as well. So the stakeholder consultation and involvement are really important at various stages in the KBA identification and delineation process. So this includes consultation with knowledge holders, consensus building with proposers of overlapping KBAs, and involvement of customary rights holders. The idea is that this is a bottom-up process. So that's why the stakeholder consultation and involvement really underpins the whole process of KBA identification and delineation. So KBAs are identified and delineated by local and national constituencies using globally standardized criteria, thresholds, and delineation procedures. So in the example that I'll start talking about in a moment with the Western Ghats, the role of my team, the IUCN Freshwater Biodiversity Unit, we have an international remit. Our kind of role in this is to bring together and standardize all of the global data on the global range of the species and the threat status and so on. But then we take that and work with organizations and stakeholders locally and regionally to actually identify and propose the key biodiversity areas. So this is not something which happens top down, although we kind of support the process internationally. This is very much something which is, the idea is that it happens bottom up with consultation with local stakeholders. Just to mention also about reassessment. So confirmed KBAs should be reassessed against the KBA criteria and thresholds at least every 8 to 12 years, with more frequent monitoring recommended where possible, but as a minimum every 8 to 12 years. And both genuine status change and new information about the biodiversity elements that triggered the KBA and the thresholds may affect the status of the KBA. Okay, so you've just been through the first two modules of the new KBA training materials, actually. So you're some of the first people to have been exposed to this. So hopefully that gave you a good overview of what KBAs are, why they're important, and how they're identified. And for the next part of the presentation, I won't take too long on this, but I did want to give you a bit of a focus, given that this is a webinar for BCF in India. We do actually have some work ongoing in the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about our work in this area as well. There are two existing publications which are relevant to this work, and you can access them through, I've put a link in the bottom of this slide to the IUCN Freshwater Publications webpage, or even if you simply type into Google IUCN Freshwater Publications, then that would be the first hit. If you search within that for Western Ghats, there are two key documents. The first one was, I think that was published in 2011, was the status and distribution of freshwater biodiversity in the Western Ghats. So that's more about the IUCN Red List assessment. So that addresses all of the freshwater taxonomic groups. So again, freshwater fish, crabs, shrimps, aquatic plants, mollusks, and their threat status. And then the other report is actually specifically about identifying freshwater key biodiversity areas, and within the Western Ghats, it's focused further. It's focused further into the southern areas of the biodiversity hotspots, so in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So that those two existing reports, which you can go and find out some more background information on this work. Here's just a map of the outcome of the consultative process, which happened in 2014, was the identification of these key biodiversity areas. So as I say, that was in 2014. So these sites were actually identified before the KBA global standard was published in 2016. So what this means is that some of these sites potentially don't meet the global standard for KBAs. And so what my job now is to compile all of the necessary data and information on all of these sites to check, firstly, whether each one meets the KBA criteria, the new KBA criteria, and B, if they do meet the KBA criteria, then we need to compile and provide all of the proper documentation to support a formal proposal of freshwater key biodiversity area. And once we've done that for the sites which qualify, then they will be included in the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, and they'll be accessible through the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment tool, which I mentioned earlier. So they'll be actually available then to inform conservation activities and conservation funding, and also development in the private sector as well. So this is just an overview of those sites, and I'll be happy to share this with anyone who's interested. I'll provide my email at the end of the presentation as well. So anyone who wants a copy of this, I'll be very happy to share it with you. So the work that happened in 2014 was also led by the IUCN Freshwater Biodiversity Unit, but this was before I joined the team. So this was one of my predecessors who led on this. As I mentioned, it was in 2014, and this was a CEPF project to identify the potential freshwater key biodiversity areas in Kerala and Tamil Nadu through using the Red List assessments, refining and validating the KBAs through the stakeholder consultation workshops, and then actually applying those thresholds to arrive at that map which I just showed you. So those freshwater key biodiversity area sites. And that work was supported by IUCN and Zoo, the Zoo Outreach Organization, and there were multiple workshops. I've mentioned this report already on the status and distribution of freshwater biodiversity in the Western Ghats. And this is just a summary of one of the main tables from that report. But what this is showing you is for each freshwater taxonomic group, so those are in the columns, the number of species which were threatened, so either critically endangered, or vulnerable. So you can see quite a few species there which are eligible to trigger key biodiversity areas in the Western Ghats. And then there's just a map also in the report of the species richness. In the freshwater biodiversity unit, we tend to map everything to catchments, which are the hydrobasins catchments. So including the red list range maps and also the key biodiversity areas as well. So for freshwater species, the purpose of identifying the key biodiversity areas is, as we've mentioned, it allows strategic expansion of protected areas to cover important areas for freshwater species, and can also focus conservation donor funding, such as CPF, which we've mentioned, the inputs to CBD targets, and can also provide supplementary information to other sites, such as Ramsar wetland sites. So the methodology, we've kind of covered this in the introduction to KBAs, but to summarize, it's defining the geographic boundaries of the sites, setting the wider ecological context, assembling all of the red list species data to complement a proposal of the KBA, and to select sites based on all of this data to ensure that we're targeting the most important sites for freshwater biodiversity. The stakeholder consultation workshops, which I've mentioned, so that's already happened in 2014, but now we could probably do with having some more stakeholder consultation, just to make sure that the information that we have is the most up to date before we propose any KBAs formally to the KBA Secretariat. These are just some of the maps as well from that work in 2014. So this is for all species. So these are species which can trigger KBA status, either because they are threatened or because they're range restricted. And so you're seeing those catchments which have the highest number of potential KBA trigger species in that project area. And then within taxonomic groups, or as a breakdown, this is the odonates, so the dragonflies and damselflies. Here's the map for the freshwater mollusks. So you can see just one catchment there, which is quite important to a couple of species of threatened mollusks. The freshwater fishes, a number of species potentially triggering KBAs there in each subcatchment. Freshwater crabs as well, and also aquatic plants, so plants which are restricted to aquatic habitat types, and also the shrimps as well. And again, there's that map, which all of that data taken and then filtered through the stakeholder consultation workshops, they arrived at this set of, I think it was 27 freshwater key biodiversity areas, which we now need to refine. This is just an example of the data sheet which supplements one of those key biodiversity areas. So in this catchment, it was identified as being important for many trigger species. So again, when I mention trigger species, that's all of the species which meet which meet the criteria for proposing that key biodiversity area. So you can see for this one site, it was important for many, many species, including several species of fishes, dragonflies, and aquatic plants. So we've compiled already all of this information back at the workshops in 2014. What it would be really useful to get now is, I mentioned the presence and the reproductive unit thresholds. So anyone who's working in this region, if you have information on any freshwater species within the region, then I'm very keen to hear from you. Since these KBAs were identified, the thresholds have actually been increased, so they're stricter now than they used to be. So we need to prove that the species occur in sufficient numbers in these sites to actually formally propose them as KBAs. I'll just wrap up the presentation with just a few more slides to set this in context. So for each KBA, I've kind of just talked about all of this. So we need to compile all of this information. We have lots of the information already for lots of the sites in the Western Ghats, and as I say, you can go and read more in those reports. But any additional information since 2014, or any information that that people can provide to support these KBA proposals would be most welcome. Apologies for just skipping through those past couple of slides. They're quite heavy on the text, and I think I've already explained the content of those slides. So finally, I just wanted to show you the new Key Biodiversity Areas website, which launched yesterday. In fact, was it yesterday? No, it was Monday. On Monday, the new Key Biodiversity Areas website went live. So this is a link at the end of the presentation, and lots more context. Hopefully that will mute themselves. So you can go and find the KBA standard, the guidelines, lots of supporting documentation. You can also link through from the website to the Google group. So there's a Google group for the KBA's community where you can go and participate in discussion and see the latest news about key biodiversity areas. And there's also a regular newsletter which comes out, I think it's every 3 months, which you can access through the Google group as well. And that's all linked to from the KBA website. The best thing about the new website, which was, as I say, just launched this week, is that we now have this this dashboard, and you can click through from the main Key Biodiversity Areas website. And if you just click on Explore Data, then you get this map, and you can focus in on a specific region or on a specific country. So you can see here, I've focused in on India, of course. And so we can see the number of key biodiversity areas which already exist in India. You can see the proportion of key biodiversity areas which are covered by protected areas or partially covered by protected areas. And as I mentioned, that's actually an official metric which is included in 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that one's quite important. You can see the area that's covered by key biodiversity areas. And also this one on trigger species is quite interesting as well. So that's the species for which the key biodiversity areas have been identified. Because BirdLife kind of has got there first and has done so much work already on identifying important bird and biodiversity areas, which are now incorporated as key biodiversity areas, you'll see in many places birds are by far the most prevalent KBA trigger species. And so the work that we're doing now in the Freshwater Biodiversity Unit is trying to identify more sites for freshwater species, and also to identify existing KBAs, which are also important for freshwater species, but they don't know they are important for freshwater species yet. So it's providing that additional information to support the existing sites by demonstrating how they're important for freshwater biodiversity as well. So that's that trigger species pie chart there. And you've also got this threats chart, which highlights the main threats to identified within the key biodiversity areas. So in this case, within India. So you can see that the most common threat identified against these key biodiversity areas is agriculture, and also things coming out like logging, residential and commercial development. So these things probably don't surprise you, but it's useful to be able to see it there in that chart. You can go and click also on the map on any key biodiversity area. And perhaps I haven't included a slide of this, but I really highly recommend you go and explore for yourself. You can click on any biodiversity area, key biodiversity area on the map, and it will take you through to a fact sheet which tells you about a little bit of information about the site and also the species for which the site has qualified as a KBA. So I recommend you go and explore that. I mentioned the KBA community. You can click through to it from the Key Biodiversity Areas website. If you have any feedback on the first section or the first two sections of this presentation, which are about introducing the key biodiversity areas and the criteria, then any feedback is welcome. Feedback on the guidelines, specifically to the chair of the KBA Secretariat, or on the KBA training materials, you can get in touch with me or the KBA Secretariat. And yeah, I mentioned the KBA community already. That's just the email address for the chair of the KBA community. But the best way to interact would be to go through to the Google group. I've mentioned the global standard already, which you can download from the website. And also, that just kind of provides the basic information on the criteria and the thresholds and gives you the numbers. But if you actually want to really understand the whole process behind identifying KBAs, then I recommend you also go through to the website and go and find the guidelines for using the KBA global standard. And that goes into a lot more detail about how to actually work on and identify and support these sites. Finally, I'll just come back to the Western Ghats one more time, because, as I say, if anyone has any data which can potentially contribute or support to our proposing formally these freshwater key biodiversity areas in the Western Ghats, then that would be most welcome. So I know that was a lot of information to take in, but I hope most of you are still with us, and I hope you found that useful information. And thank you very much for your patience and for joining us today. Do we have time for any questions? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful presentations for us. Thank you.